Welcome to this series of videos on brioche knitting. These are designed for any level, so if you haven't done any brioche knitting at all before, these are perfect for you. We're going to start with the fundamental stitches of brioche knitting and create some basic brioche rib in one colour. Once you've mastered these stitches, you can then move on to increases and decreases, which are what create these distinctive waves that we see in brioche knitting. Then we can move on to the two colour brioche and learn how to create these exciting designs. So if you are new to knitting, then I would recommend getting a few projects under your belt first so that you're confident with your knitting and purling and slip stitches before you give these videos a go. So let's get started with the basic brioche stitches. Here's an example of a basic one colour brioche ribbed fabric. It looks very much like a 1x1 rib. You've got these columns of knit stitches here, and where we would normally have purl stitches, we have the normal little bars that you would get with a purl stitch, but you also have these diagonal arms coming out, and that is what gives it its stretch and it's kind of more voluminous kind of appearance than just a basic 1x1 rib. So we're going to start by creating this, and we're going to learn the two basic brioche stitches that you will need to create any bit of knitting. So I've got a double knit cotton, and I'm using two 3.5mm needles. Now I'm using double pointed needles just because it's easier for the purpose of this video so they don't bang on the table, but you can use whatever needles you have, whether they're the normal straight needles or circular needles, whatever you prefer to use. So I'm going to start by casting on 21 stitches, and this needs to be quite a loose cast on or a stretchy cast on, so you can either do that over a larger needle, over two needles, or just use a stretchy cast on. So I'm going to do long tail cast on. If you don't know how to do this, I'll put a link to a video in the top. So 21 stitches, so that's my first one. I'm trying to do this quite loose. I'm not pulling these tight at all. 4, 5. So just keep going until you've got 21 stitches. So in brioche knitting, we have a main side, which could be considered your right side, and we have a contrast side, which could be considered your wrong side, but because brioche knitting is reversible, they're not really right and wrong sides. It's just that the main side would be where you create your pattern, and the contrast side is the reverse. So I'm going to do my first setup row, and because brioche knitting is so stretchy, it's good to have a couple of selvage stitches. So on this contrast side, I am going to slip with my yarn in front these end stitches when I come to them. So they're not part of the brioche stitch process as such, they're just my selvage stitches. So we're going to start on this first setup row. We've got our yarn held to the front of the needle, and we're just going to slip this stitch off purlwise. Now we need to bring our yarn to the back because our next stitch is a knit, and we're going to bring it between the needles like this. Okay, so then we're going to knit one stitch. So now we're going to do our first brioche stitch, and this is called a slip one yarn over. So this is performed on every alternate stitch along for the basic rib, and when you're doing a slip on yarn over, the yarn must always be held at the front before you slip. So we're going to bring the yarn between the needles to the front. We're going to put our needle tips facing each other together and slip purlwise. And then we're going to wrap the yarn over to the back, ready for our next stitch, which will be a knit. So you can see this yarn is going over the top of this slipped stitch here, sometimes referred to as a shawl or a collar on this stitch. So if we knit our next stitch, you can see there it's crossed over, it's kind of hugging that slip stitch. So we've done a knit one, and now we're going to do another slip one yarn over. So bring your yarn between the needles to the front and slip the next stitch purlwise, and take your yarn to the back to wrap the stitch. Now next stitch is a knit, so you'll notice because we're doing slips and knits with the yarn over, when you bring your yarn to the front and slip, because our next stitch is a knit, the yarn will automatically go over the top, and then we knit the next stitch. So you don't really need to think about slipping it and wrapping it over, because our next stitch is a knit. If we've brought the yarn to the front, slipped our stitch, we can just knit the next one and the yarn will wrap over the slip stitch. So yarn between the needles to the front, slip stitch purlwise, and just knit the next stitch, and you can see that the yarn over will automatically be created on that slip stitch. So yarn front, slip a stitch, knit the next stitch, letting the yarn go over the top of the needle, yarn front, slip, knit the next stitch, let the yarn go over, and just carry on in that way until we get to our last stitch. So our last stitch is our selvage stitch, so we're going to bring our yarn between the needles to the front and just slip that one. There we go, and that's our setup row on the contrast side done. So we've got our selvage stitches at the end, we can just ignore those for now. And you will see the stitches alternate. So here we've got our wrapped stitch, our slip one yarn over, with our yarn over wrapping over the top of that slip, and then this is the stitch that we knit. Then we've got another double stitch, if you like, the wrapped yarn over stitch and a knit stitch, and that is what it should look like all the way along. You should have these yarn over kind of double stitches and then a single stitch all the way along. Now these wrap stitches are counted as one stitch, so if I was to check my stitch count on here, I would still have 21 stitches, because I include these two, this slip one yarn over, as one stitch. Okay, so now we're going to work our first main side row. So it's just a selvage stitch on the end, so we're just going to knit our first stitch. Now you can see that the next stitch on the needle is just a stitch all on its own. So this stitch we need to do a slip one yarn over. So we'll bring our yarn between the needles to the front again, and we're slipping. And then when we do our next knit stitch, it will go over the top and wrap that stitch. Now you can see our next stitch is one of our slip one yarn overs from the previous row. So it's a stitch here that we slipped, and it's got this yarn over wrapping diagonally across it. Now in this stitch now we're going to do a brioche knit stitch. So all that means is that we knit this yarn over and the slip stitch together. So we're going to put our needle to knit through both of those loops, wrap the yarn and just knit. Okay, and now we're back to a slip one yarn over, so yarn is always to the front when we slip. So between the needles to the front, slip the next stitch, And then our next one will be a brioche knit, so you can see it's got this slip stitch with this yarn over crossing diagonally. So as we brioche knit into those 2 loops, our slip stitch here gets its little yarn over. So we're bringing the yarn to the front and slipping and then brioche knitting. So our yarn will go over the top of the needle to create a slip-on yarn over, brioche knit. So we're just going to continue along the row in that way. So yarn between the needles to the front, slip, brioche knit into those 2 loops. Yarn between the needles to the front, slip, brioche knit, and that will create the little yarn over, yarn to the front, slip, brioche knit, and just keep going until we get to our last 2 stitches. Let's just pull a bit more yarn out. Okay, so we're at the last 2 stitches now. So I've just done a brioche knit, so my next stitch is a slip-on yarn over. So I'm bringing the yarn between the needles to the front and slip, and then our last stitch is a knit, so that will create our yarn over the slip stitch, and that's our first main side brioche knit row done. Because we are slipping alternate stitches along the row in brioche knitting, we're only working half the stitches. So when we work back along this contrast side row, we're going to work the stitches that were slipped on the main side. So that really means that it takes 2 rows of brioche knitting to create a complete row, because we're only working half the stitches on each side. So we need to do a main side row, which we've just done, and a contrast side row, which we're about to do, to count as 1 row of knitting. So we're going to start with our yarn held in front of our needle, and we're going to slip with yarn in front that first selvage stitch. Now our next stitch is a brioche knit. You can see that it has its little yarn over the stitch, so we need to make sure that we take our needle to the back between, our yarn to the back between the needles, instead of wrapping the yarn over the top to do that first brioche knit stitch. And now we're going to do a slip-on yarn over. You can see it's a little single stitch. We'll bring our yarn to the front between the needles, slip the stitch purlwise, and then we're just going to brioche knit the next 2 loops together. Yarn between the needles to the front, slip 1, brioche knit, and we're just doing that again all the way along this row. So yarn front, slip, brioche knit into those 2 loops. Now when you're slipping, it will always be a single loop that you are slipping, and it will look a little bit like a purl stitch. So it's got this horizontal bump along, and when you're brioche knitting, it will always be into one that has, I don't know if you can see that, the little kind of V loop that you would get with a knit stitch, and it will always be 2 loops. It will have this diagonal yarn over and the stitch that was slipped on the previous row. So if you ever lose your place in a row, if the next stitch here is a single stitch, you know it's a slip-on yarn over. So bring your yarn to the front and slip, and then brioche knit those 2 loops. So just continue to the end, slip 1 yarn over and brioche knit. So when we're doing the brioche knits, that's what's creating those vertical columns of knit stitches that we saw in our piece here. So I've got to my last stitch, and it's a contrast side row, so I'm going to bring the yarn between the needles to the front, and then I'm just going to slip that last selvage stitch with the yarn in front. There we go, and that's our contrast side row done. So for the basic brioche rib, those 2 rows are all we need, the main side row and the contrast side row, and we're just alternating a brioche knit with a slip one yarn over. So I'm on my main side row, and I'm going to knit the first one, bring the yarn between the needles to the front, slip one yarn over, and it will always be a single stitch, and then I'm brioche knitting into those 2 loops, yarn forward, slip one yarn over. Now I've come to my next stitch, and it's a brioche knit, but it's just on its own, it hasn't got its yarn over. So if this happens, you just need to have a look below the stitch, and you can see there's a loop here, this horizontal loop that's going in front of the stitch that doesn't look right, and that's because the yarn over has dropped off while we've been knitting our previous row. So all you need to do, just slide the stitch across, and we'll just grab that yarn over and pop it back on. So now you can see the yarn over is back on its stitch where it should be, instead of in front here, and it will always run from the right hand side diagonally across to the left, so you can make sure that you put it back on the stitch the right way. And then we're going to brioche knit this one. So if you come to a stitch that should be a brioche knit, but it's only got 1 loop, have a look at the front or behind to see if the little yarn over has fallen off. Okay, so we're going to carry on working along. So yarn front, slip one yarn over, brioche knit, yarn front, slip one yarn over, brioche knit, slip one yarn over, brioche knit, and just carry on like this until we get to the last 2 stitches of our main side row. So slip one yarn over, brioche knit. Okay, so we've just done a brioche knit, so we bring yarn to the front, slip one yarn over, and just knit that last stitch. So now we're on our contrast side row, and I can tell that because this last stitch here, the yarn is at the front, and I can see that it's been knitted, and the next stitch after it is a brioche knit, so I know that I'm on a contrast side row. So I'm going to hold the yarn at the front, slip the first stitch, our selvage stitch, taking the yarn between the needles to the back, ready for our first brioche knit, and then just yarn between the needles to the front, slip yarn over, brioche knit, slip yarn over, brioche knit, and again just repeat all the way along the row. Slip yarn over, brioche knit, slip yarn over, brioche knit. So yarn to the front, slip, knit, yarn front, slip, brioche knit. Okay, until we get to that last stitch, and we bring the yarn to the front and slip. Okay, so there you can see it's starting to form the little vertical columns of knit stitches in between these what look like purl columns, but there are slipped columns, and on the reverse side these slip yarn over columns are our knit columns. So if you just carry on working a few more rows, you should start to see the brioche rib pattern coming together, and it should start to look like this. Here's what it should look like after a few rows. Once you feel like you've mastered this and you've done enough, I'm going to show you now one option for a stretchy bind off. So I've just finished on a contrast side row, so I'm on a main side row now, and I'm going to knit that selvage stitch. Then I can bring the yarn to the front, and instead of doing a slip-on yarn over, I'm just going to purl this stitch. Then I'm going to take the yarn to the back between the needles and knit the next brioche knit. Bring the yarn to the front between the needles and just purl that stitch. Oops. Take the yarn to the back between the needles, brioche knit the next stitch. So we're just returning these to normal knit and purl stitches. So yarn front, purl the next stitch, yarn to the back, brioche knit, between the needles to the front, purl, between the needles to the back, brioche knit, and just carry on like that all the way along the row. Okay, so now we're going to start by knitting the first 2 stitches. And then we're going to put the tip of our left needle into the front of the 2 stitches on the right needle. So we're basically just knitting through the back loop. So we're just going to wrap the yarn around the needle and pull it through. Okay, then we're going to knit the next stitch. And again, we take the left needle tip, put it in the front of the 2 stitches on the right needle, and just knit these through the back loop, and we're just going to carry on along like that. So knit 1, knit 2 together through the back loop, knit 1, knit these 2 together through the back loop, knit 1, knit 2 together through the back loop. So just work your way along like that until you get to the end. So I've come to the last stitch. I'm just going to knit that last stitch, put my needle in and knit those 2 together through the back loop, grab my scissors, cut the yarn, and then just pull that through. And there you go. That's your first piece of brioche ribbon. Now if you want to have a go at something like this, that will be kind of the next stage after doing a basic brioche rib. We've got some increases and decreases here, and that's what creates the lovely wavy pattern. So if you want to have a go at that, you go head over to our next tutorial. I'll put a link at the top, and all this information is available in a written PDF which you can download from our website, and there's a link for that in the comments below.